But you know the problem.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me enormous pleasure indeed to introduce Vasudha Dalmia, who is on her first visit to Bihar, so it is a first for many of us. She's going to talk on modernity and modernism in the Hindi world, and by way of introduction, I suppose, I don't need to introduce her. She's a professor of Hindi. She's been at Berkeley, at Yale. She's Professor Emeritus at Berkeley now. And as far as modernity is concerned, requires a little more telling. There was a time when modernity was a very simple thing. It was shiny and single and came from the West, and everyone wanted it. And the pluralization of modernities in our times is one of the bewildering phenomena, not least because, of course, this variety of modernities, these pluralized modernities, all seem to march under the singular name of modernity. And modernism, again, is a somewhat different story. And so I'm looking forward to hearing Professor Vasudha Dalmia on modernity and modernism in the Hindi world. Vasudha.
Thank you, Alok. What I'm going to try and get across to you in the half hour and more that I have is a series of thoughts that I have presented in the introduction to my... Are you having trouble listening? Mm-hmm. Should it be louder? Okay. Right? Is that better? Yes. Okay. In speaking about modernity and modernism in the Hindi world, what I present here today is an introduction to a book that Permanent Black has brought out early this year. I have called my book Fiction as History, the Novel and the City in Modern North India. It traces the changing configurations of urban lives as represented in 8 Hindi novels set in 6 different Indian cities. In Agra, in Allahabad, Banaras, Delhi, Lahore and Lucknow. I'm only sorry that Patna is not included. It would, I think, belong in this story. My book begins with the emergence of a specific variety of middle-class speakers of a self-consciously Hindu Hindi in the latter half of the 19th century and ends in the last years of the Nehruvian era. The colonial and the post-colonial are thus viewed as integrally connected, culturally, socially, as much as politically. Why urban North India and why the Hindi novel, when Hindi fiction is associated more with novels about peasants, particularly those of Premchand, now regarded as the classic Hindi author? For one, modernization took place at a greater pace in cities rather than in the agricultural countryside. For another, the story of the rather more spectacular modernity of the presidency towns, Bombay and Madras and Calcutta in particular, has been told and retold. The northwest of Bengal has generally been regarded as lagging, provincial and late on the scene. Leaving others to judge whether this was really so, I will outline other reasons why this story seems worth telling. Unlike Bengal, which had the one great urban center, Calcutta, founded by the British and developed as the capital of British India, the North had a number of scattered cities, all of them older and with histories of their own. In these cities, there was already an identifiable elite culture in place, a culture that 1857, please remember 1857 is a very important cut-off point, that 1857 disrupted this culture and shattered it. The modernization that followed thereafter also had then other foundations than those to be found in Calcutta and the presidency towns. And an important intellectual aspect of these is the Hindi literature that emerged from within these cities. Modern Hindi was born in these cities of North India, where Urdu and Persian had prevailed, out of the need of an emergent Hindu middle class to find cultural and political expression. It was in the cities that this middle class faced the need to modernize and to accommodate an evolved social change, and where it received intellectual stimulus. This invigoration came from various encounters through education in the new colleges in the cities, founded from the late 19th century on by the Indian elite. We have to remember that these colleges, though they had British names, were founded by Indians. From intellectual discourse available through print, missionary tracts, newspapers, books, and through dealings with Western institutions of governance, the municipality and law court, amongst others. I start here with a brief recapitulation of the novel as a genre and its role in partly creating, partly anticipating the story of middle-class modernity and modernism. The novel's distinction as a genre is that it is capacious, and therefore the best suited to show up the multiplicity of voices of a given era. Bakhtin defined it as a diversity of social speech types, sometimes even a diversity of languages and a diversity of individual voices artistically organized. The early Hindi novels are sometimes roughly hewn, but their formal unevenness notwithstanding, things that are not possible elsewhere in literature are anticipated and often made to come to fruition by imagining, allowing for transgressions and giving them space, and by the sheer act of making possible in narrative what is not yet possible, socially permissible. The novels I choose for depiction and analysis in my book all have secure positions and enduring reputations in the Hindi literary canon. Three reasons determine the choice of these specific works. First, their urban location, which entailed reading the Hindi literary tradition against the grain, since the tradition has been known largely for the great peasant novels of the vast agricultural countryside, which made up most of the North. Various urban locations began to interest me when I realized that over the past 2 centuries, from the time of the Great Uprising in 1857, no single urban location in the North could be identified as the epicenter of the region's cultural activity. The British chose to deliberately play down the importance of Delhi and Agra, seeing them as too powerfully connected to Mughal power and the authority radiated by the regime they were replacing. And so, from the third quarter of the 19th century, they developed Lahore and Allahabad instead as regional urban centers. I looked for novels that were deeply rooted in these cities, those that could help me chart the path of the modernity on which the North embarked only in the mid-19th century after the final overthrow of the Mughals. My second criterion of selection was the focus on young people, on those who were often in the later novels, at least from the 1930s on, university students, or else characters still struggling to stabilize themselves in some social position or in some suitable profession or the other, sometimes struggling in the process against what the older generation had laid out as a life plan for them. The third criterion for selection came about almost inadvertently, but then became a determining factor, and that was the novel's depiction of the political climate of the era. Private lives were touched and formed, and relationships were forged, nurtured, or destroyed by the momentum that these political moments generated, propelling them, affecting the identity and self-definition, and at times shaping their very existence. So these are a series of things that happened. They're part of modern Indian history. I don't need to recapitulate them here. The social reforms of the late 19th and early 20th century, the Gandhian Satyagraha, the Quit India movement, the World War, the Second World War, and also the communalism, partition, and of course the Cold War. All of them play a role in the novel. The writing of novels in the vernacular happened initially at the behest of the British, who were eager to put together pedagogical material in Hindi for the benefit of their administrators. Gopal Rai, historian of the novel in Hindi, has called this first period, which he saw as beginning in 1803 and lasting all the way till 1869, as a knocking on the door, darwaze par dastak. He sees the next period, from 1870 to 1890, as part of the new awakening in the North. Next we have 1891 to 1917 as the period of romance, readership formation, and the novel. Following this, 1918 to 1947, that means practically the first part of the 20th century, as the period of the new voices of realism, divisible into two periods. The first, 1918 to 36, with the peasant as focus, and the second, 1937 to 47, as a search for new directions. Finally, Rai sees 1948 to 1980, the first decades of independence, as the period of new horizons of discourse, Vimarsh ke naye kshitij. I don't follow him beyond this point because this is where my study ends. The first novel I discuss is Pariksha Guru. It's a very unusual novel because it is set in late 19th century Delhi. There is only the old city, and it's very didactic, but it has a number of details that we won't find anywhere else, information that only a novel can contain, and it of course is very unself-critically nationalist in its tone. It is only with the advent of Prem Chand that a realistic portrayal of middle and lower middle class urban life enters the novel. In fact, Gopal Rai begins his third period. I have skipped the second because it has nothing of interest for me. He calls this third period New Voices of Realism. With the publication of the novel I deal with in my second chapter, Prem Chand's Seva Sadan, this new period begins, this new realism. Seva Sadan is set in the inner lanes of Banaras. It is the novel centered on the life of a courtesan. With its attention to the wider social fabric of the city and its concern with the municipal debates on the removal of the courtesan quarter of the city to the outskirts of the city. There are debates in the municipal council, and these debates become extremely communalized. That is the really interesting part of the novel, how a social occasion can be used to actually hijack a discussion into whether the courtesans are Muslim or whether they are Hindu, who stands to make the most money from keeping them in the city or for removing them. So it is a novel that begins with a very small tale but then widens out to include the whole city. Nearly 2 decades after this first novel, Prem Chand wrote his second novel, his penultimate, also set in Banaras. The action of Karma Bhumi, 1932, the third novel I focus on, takes place primarily in the inner part of a modernizing Banaras, though it also moves between a country and a city, between country and city. The politics of the time are formative, not only for the two protagonists, a husband and a wife, but also for their relationship with each other. Now, of course, this is the period where the figure of Gandhi looms large in their lives and in their relationships to each other. This is what I found the most interesting about my novels. Whatever the political climate of the age, it penetrates deeply into private lives and it shapes them. It also shapes relationships. Next, I turn to a novel dealing with the 1940s, the epic novel Jhootha Sach, False Truth, 1958-1960, by the well-known Hindi author Yashpal. In its matter-of-fact tone and faithfulness to observed reality, Yashpal is closer to Premchand than to the novelists of the second section of this book. He's writing almost a chronicle, a date-by-date portrayal of a series of events where private lives are so keyed in to what is happening on the political scene. You know, he'll say June 3rd, partition is announced. On such and such a date, we find out that Lahore is going to belong to Pakistan because that was disputed territory. All of that plays into the novel and into private lives again in a way that I think no other novelist of his time has been able to depict. Novel writing sought new horizons from the late 1940s. Gopal Rai has noted that this has seen this as the period for exploring new horizons of discourse. My second set of novels, now we've left Gandhi and we've left the independence movement behind, we've also left nationalism behind. The works that I have picked up, I call them more modernist than modern, because they don't really operate, I will talk about it again, with any certainty that the path that they follow is the right one. There is no right path as such, you have to look for it, and there's no guarantee that it will take you anywhere. So the works I have picked are more modernist than modern, beginning with Agay's Nadi Ke Dweep, Islands in the Stream, 1948 to 1952, which is set in 1940s Delhi and Lucknow and ends with World War II and the Japanese incursion into India. Rekha and Bhuvan, the novel's two main characters, meet in the modernized section of the city and find each other in the hills of Kumaon, outside city life with its compulsions and conventions. Nadi Ke Dweep explores interiorities, intertwining poetry with the prose that is also lyrical and self-reflexive. Lyricism also pervades the poet, novelist, and dramatist Dharamveer Bharti's almost a cult novel, Gunahon Ka Devta, The God of Vice, 1949, which was to become a cult novel for several generations of youthful readers. The novel was written as a rejoinder to the political split of the Hindi literary world, which had polarized into camps in the wake of the Cold War. So you see, the Cold War is playing into not only how writers see themselves, but how also they write their works. And as I said, this is one of the things that I have found interesting in undertaking this work, how closely politics are intertwined with private life. So this novel takes place in a civil lines bungalow in Allahabad. Now what is interesting is that with these set of novels, post-independence novels, we by and large, not altogether, we by and large move out of the inner city and into also new emotional and intellectual terrains. People are living in the newer parts of the city, in the civil lines, or in newly built colonies, And they lead completely different lives from those who are still caught up in the web of lanes that build the inner cities of the north. For my last two novels, I turned to two writers, Mohan Rakesh and Rajendra Yadav, who belong to yet another prominent movement in Hindi, namely Nai Kahani, or the new short story, which evolved in the 1950s and 1960s. These are the novels that actually, I won't go into the details for lack of time, but both these novels actually, here is where you see that nationalism and the notion that marriage brings any kind of happiness or fulfillment in personal lives, that effectively the individual is alone, whether in a marital union, desired or not, is actually no resolution to the problems of a person's own life. So the simplistic notion, love, romance, as culminating in a happy or an unhappy ending, are actually no part any longer of the intellectual and emotional frame of the novel. The two novels that I talk about are set, one in Agra and one in New Delhi. This New Delhi is very different from the Delhi of the older novels, which was, as I said, caught up in the lanes of Shahjahanabad. I'd like to talk a little bit about the cities before I conclude my paper, because I've just laid out the novels for you to give you a sense of the passing of time and of the political upheavals that affected personal lives so deeply. Turning now to the cities themselves, let me say a few words about city geography as it figures in my book. Transferred to literature, city geography can refer to a study of literature in space and or space in literature. My book is concerned with both. I begin with laying out the history and geography of a city space in question, a particular milieu as represented by the author, which produces a certain kind of sociality, out of which grows a social person in the novel to which he or she brings his or her individual traits and relationships. So in dealing with the city, I'm also dealing with the social milieu, and out of that milieu emerges the character of the novel, who brings his or her personal traits to what is happening to the history and geography of the place that he or she is located in. Towards the end of the long auctorial journey that he entitled his Discovery of India, Jawaharlal Nehru spoke evocatively of the region that lies at the heart of this book, of my own book, of which he himself was a product. He says, I quote, "The United Provinces, including Delhi, are a curious amalgam and in some ways an epitome of India. They are the seat of the old Hindu culture as well as of Persian culture that came in with the Afghan and Mughal times, and hence the mixture of the two is most in evidence there, intermingled with the cultures of the West." This Indo-Persian culture of which Nehru speaks was particularly marked in the prime cities of the region. In Delhi, the seat of government of ever larger tracts of the subcontinent from at least the 12th century. In Agra, the alternative Mughal capital of the region from the late 15th century. In Lahore, patronized by Jahangir. In Allahabad, where Akbar had built a fort, and in Lucknow, which emerged in the post-Mughal era as the capital of the Nawabs of the region. Large parts of these cities would be practically wiped off the map with the reprisals that came in the wake of the 1857 uprising. It took a while before they became politically and culturally ready to intermingle or negotiate in any substantive way with the language and idiom of the British. Lahore came into the Hindi scenario much later, after the British conquest of Punjab in 1849, when Urdu or Hindustani became the language of the province. And it was only from the late 19th century that the Arya Samaj began to promote Hindi in this region. So, Hindi came to Punjab very late, and it also died out. Punjab, with that I mean Western Punjab, and I'm thinking specifically of Lahore. It came very late to Lahore, and it died out after partition. So it had a very short lifespan. Our sixth city, Banaras, where 2 of the 8 novels that I discuss are set, was culturally different from the other cities of the north. It had been the center of Sanskrit learning for many centuries, and naturally also formed the center of modern Hindi literary Hindi as it took shape from the 19th century. However, even though Banaras was the center of Hindi literature for many decades, we have to remember that it did not become the cultural center of the north per se, because only of modern Hindi literature. There is no cultural center of the north after 1857, once the British take over North India. There is no one cultural center. Amongst the features of urban change in the Hindi belt worth thinking about are, first, the vastness of the destruction of property and lives after the uprising. This being something that none of the presidency towns experienced, and second, the new colonial administrative frame in which the population, particularly of the towns and cities, lived, the hitherto unknown municipalities and law courts which now rule their lives. And third, access to higher education made possible by the colleges built at private Indian expense in the cities, and the culture of informed critique and insubordination that they came eventually to foster. And fourth, the roads that, and I find those very interesting, the roads that the British cut through densely populated areas of the inner cities, symbolic of their attempts to cut through only a partially understood culture. These new roads symbolized an order forcibly established. So these are things that we have to remember, because this is what makes the North so different from, as I said, the presidency cities of Bombay and Calcutta and Madras, because there is a culture already in place. There is a violent resistance to British rule in 1857. There is a violent reaction which actually destroys the cities of the north, at least as they were before 1857, and the emergence of a Hindu elite after that, a Hindu middle class which seeks Hindi as its language, which creates this Hindi as its language, and which begins, in these novels are proof of that, which begins to imagine, in Benedict Anderson's words, a new community of, which is actually exclusively Hindu. Because none of my novels, very few of them, there are some, have Muslim characters. It's an entirely Hindu world that they imagine, you know. So major demographic and cultural shifts were a natural corollary to the physical and architectural alteration of the cities by the British. And I'm speaking of Delhi. More Hindus were admitted back into the city than Muslims. They began returning as early as January 1858 to Shah Jahanabad and Delhi. Okay. The Muslims, who began to be let in a year later, had to prove themselves innocent of any part in the uprising and be duly certified. So this, you see that this is how a Hindu community is being, a new Hindu elite is being created. Those who derived the greatest profit from the transactions were Hindu merchants who had remained loyal through 1857. The wealthiest of these brought up the biggest Havelis in what had been the most exclusive parts of the city. Thus, a Muslim-dominant Delhi changed character, and this is the point I'm making, changed character and became Hindu merchant-dominated. This became true of many of the major cities of the north. It was this Hindu culture of the cities of North India that I speak of, and it is from the ranks of these Hindus, all of them upper caste, who are forming this self-consciously Hindu community, it is from their ranks that the protagonists of our novels emerge. Now, this new elite was not unduly impressed by English education. You have to remember that they were already very cultivated, that they were very urbane, that they had a culture of their own. Though the study of English had been introduced as early as 1827 in the Delhi College, the famous Delhi College, Altaf Hussain Ali, one of its most renowned alumni, put it bluntly, we regard the English section of the college as a means for getting a job. It's not an education. So, this is the state of Delhi. Delhi began to, but it's still, even though it begins to be Hindu dominated, its Hindi still plays no great role in Delhi till after partition. Agra, the other Mughal capital which served as the British from the northwest, from 1835 on, would suffer a similar eclipse as Delhi. The British would remove their institutions from it. They would actually shift to Allahabad. Okay? So though the cities weren't, not all North Indian cities were destroyed as thoroughly as Delhi and Lucknow were, they all suffered after 1857, and great parts of them were resettled. Before I close, let me just speak briefly about modernity, modernism, nation, and the self. As Benedict Anderson has shown, the two key forms of imagining the collectivity that ultimately became the nation in 18th century Europe were the novel and the newspaper. In the North Indian case, the novels were written from the late 19th century on. The nation figured as a major point of reference. From this point on, as we see in the first novels that I discuss, so the nation figures very greatly, but only in the beginning. In fact, as our close reading of these novels shows, the political life of North India at any given time, whether centered on nationalism, social reform, communalism, partition, or the Cold War, penetrated deeply into private lives. Politics play a large role in the formation of individual character, the goals set in life, and sometimes even the initial choice of spouses and the eventual fate of marriages and the vision of life that informs the character. In order to chart the course of North Indian modernity in the post-1857 decades, we need to take into consideration the specific cultural and historical context sketched above. What matters is how, given this particular past and this particular location and these political moments, the individual is affected and the turn that the narrative takes as a consequence thereof. I've had to shorten my paper considerably and not take you into the details of my novels because that would have taken a whole hour. I hope I've been able to get something across to you even in this truncated form. Thank you.
Okay. I believe we have 10 minutes for questions, so would you please frame your questions sharply and let's make the most of these 10 minutes. Questions and answers. Questions, please.
You didn't mention anything about Allahabad. thought that Allahabad is possibly the cultural capital of the Hindi world?
Not really, Dr. Gupta, because as I said, I rushed through my pages on the novels because I didn't want to dwell on detail too much. But one of my very important novels, one of the 8, is set in Allahabad, which of course is and in the civil lines in Allahabad, which is where government was also based, because there's no way I could skip Allahabad. It's also a very important center of Hindi once it shifts from Banaras from the second quarter of the 20th century. So Allahabad plays a big role. But you see, whether Delhi, whether Agra, whether Lahore or Allahabad, none of them becomes an exclusive center for the North of cultural life. That remains scattered. And my contention is that that has partly to do with the British, because they don't allow any one given center to come up in quite the same way. The North was a place of sedition, you know. Therefore, they removed the Delhi College, where there had been a lot of intellectual activity in the 1840s. They removed the Delhi College from Delhi to Lahore and don't allow it to come back, because they don't want to foster cultural and intellectual activity. They don't want sedition. So Allahabad is a relatively sleepy town before they make it into the seat of the High Court, and before they establish a university there. It becomes lively. So I'm not speaking against any given one city and what it contributes to life, cultural life in general, but it doesn't really become a center for the North as a whole. Not that I see it.
Hello. One of the things that was brought to my mind while listening to you is this period also happens to be the period during which the rift between Hindi and Urdu, as they later on came to be called and defined, it played out during the same period. So what kind of changes do you perceive at the level of linguistic registers as the authors are talking about the word that they have chosen to write about? How does that rift if at all, is reflected in the novel in terms of language, idioms, register? If you can comment on that.
I didn't quite understand the question. Alok, did you?
I think the question is about the language, is that right?
Yeah, actually, my question is, as Alok sir also has dealt with in his Hindi nationalism, the period from 1857 till where you end your study, this particular study, this period happens to be the period of linguistic conflict between Hindi and Urdu,
yes,
as they later on came to be defined. So my curiosity is that how does it appear at the level of linguistic register within the selected text? If I have made myself clear.
Is that okay? Go on.
To some extent, yes. Yes, I think I see what you're trying to get at. Look, let me take a personal example. I come from a half-caste family, which was based in Lucknow, though I grew up in Delhi. Now, this caste family, as castes by and large, were very attuned into the old Urdu-Persian culture, Persian-Urdu culture, right? But in the wake of nationalism, their daughters, my mother, they studied Hindi and Sanskrit because that was the way for nationalist Hindus to go in the 1930s and 40s of the 20th century. So worlds that were intertwined, that could never have been held apart because they weren't different, came in the wake of this self-consciousness of being either Muslim or Hindu to be not only bifurcated but to become extremely hostile to each other. So, for instance, in these novels, which I have studied in great detail, to look at actually what cultural worlds are being set up, because they're being set up, they are, Benedict Anderson is right, they are being imagined. In these imagined worlds, Muslims don't figure. They've just been shut out. They live, they're neighbors, they're friends. But in these novels, I mean, Premchand, we know, wrote in Urdu initially and transferred to Hindi only later for commercial reasons, not even out of any kind of patriotism. But once that step is taken, then you follow it with all its consequences. So even in Premchand novels, whether written in Urdu or in Hindi, they're novels about the Hindu world. It is this Hindu world that is created and recreated again and again in literature. Literature is a prime site for imagining these worlds.
Yeah, good morning. As an economist, I draw a lot of lessons from, or information, intuition from literature, but also culture at large.
Yes.
I have the impression that cinema and music play a major role in the modernization
Yes.
of post-independence India. So my question is, what is the relative importance, let's say, of literature, especially what you mentioned, and cinema and music in the modernization process of India?
I think that cinema and music do evolve a little differently than literature. Because in cinema, I am not myself a film expert, so I can't speak with any great authority, but only what I have read and seen myself. In cinema, it's a much more mixed world. And they create together. In fact, Hindus and Muslims do not bifurcate in the same way, especially in pre-independent cinema. Though I think I wouldn't be wrong. The people who've written about it, and I haven't studied it deeply, I don't think I would be wrong to say that even there, even in cinema, no, but there is the Muslim social. No, the worlds don't bifurcate in quite the same way. Till very lately, now of course. But I think that they remain together and are much more an integral whole than literature is. And the same would be true of music, because the great exponents of so-called of Hindustani classical music are the big Muslim figures. Yet, and people have worked on that, when you write the history of this Hindustani classical music, actually it has also been given an exclusively Hindu past, and its Muslim genealogy, its Muslim co-creation, if not entire creation, has been blended out. So I'm afraid that this Hindu nationalism has played a very nefarious role in all these fields, though it has been the most marked in literature, in that Urdu and Hindi literature have really separated ways, though they are often writing about the same kinds of people. They're not the same people, but they're the same kinds of people.
I can take one more question. Oh, yes.
There is a distinction made between Hindu and Hindustani, Hindi and Hindustani.
Yes.
And there is a movement to Sanskritize Hindi.
Yes.
Just around the time of independence in the Constitution. Is that reflected in the way novels use the language?
Northerns use the language.
The way the novels use.
Novels they use.
Is there more Hindi rather than Hindustani in later novels than in earlier novels?
You know, there are various movements even there. I mean, Premchand, and an expert is sitting right here who has, well, to some extent, you edited that volume of Urdu and, you know, the Urdu version of Premchand's story and the Hindi version of the story. So it's a very self-consciously Hindu-Hindi vocabulary that is being created in these novels to separate itself. There's always a little complex about Urdu, which is more sophisticated and which has a longer history than modern Hindi does. So modern Hindi is actually very self-consciously trying to be different, to set itself off. None of these, with the exception of one author, Nadi Ke Dweep, Agay, in the 1940s, none of them write a Sanskritized Hindi because they're writing to be read. They're writing to reach to actually as wide a readership as possible. So effectively, yes, they're using a language that is racy, that will be understood easily, and that will entice a readership rather than put it off. You know. So though they're writing in a Hindu Hindi, they're writing actually a very open Hindi, which is still writing in the language of the people. So it is still Hindustani.
Vasudha, can I come in? Because there's a really a rather subtle observation to be made there, you know, which is that even though this fact of linguistic division is happening, right through this period, it doesn't get reflected in the creative writing itself. So but the other point that you made, which is that both in Hindi and in Urdu novels, the worlds that are represented are communally separate.
Yes.
You see, so the social world, the representation of the shared world cannot happen even when the language is being shared.
Yeah.
You see, so there's something subtler that is at work.
Well, you know, but Alok, the sad part of it is that these shared worlds are also, not only are they being depicted in two sets of literatures, they are in fact increasingly separating themselves. There will come to be worlds which are more exclusive. There will come to be more Hindu, though for many decades they're not.
Organizers, please, how much time do we have? Because I believe there are more questions. Another? All right, tea break is question time. Okay, more questions then. Yes? Yeah? And then yourself. All right. Sorry. You have the mic, carry on.
Thank you. It was really a very enjoyable paper. I really enjoyed it. I mean, the novels you have sort of covered, right from Pariksha Guru to Agye. It seems that, I mean, Pariksha Gurus, it was written in sort of late 19th century, and that's the time when Hindi is still evolving, Hindi is still in the process of making. And then, you know, later novels, the language sort of becomes standardized modern Hindi. So, reading of all these sort of novels, when exactly one can see that really this whole sort of conscious agenda of, you know, defining Hindi in certain way, you can really see clearly in these writings? Or is it not happening rather there's sort of something else is also happening, parallel. So I was wondering if you could say something about it.
It's far more evident in poetry rather than novels. It's far more.
I think that because Hindi is such a deliberate creation, it is such, I've written about it at great length, what happens in the 19th century. Hindi is such a self-conscious creation, such a deliberate turning away from the Muslim right from its inception. I'm not saying it's a communal gesture, it isn't that, but it is a very fierce parting of ways. And it's a question for, of course, that it takes a while for this language to stabilize, to develop a vocabulary of its own that is not, because it has the reputation of being rustic, which it offsets by importing more words from Sanskrit in order to have a level of sophistication to express a level of nuanced thoughts that the gesture is always towards being Hindu. I don't think that it ever really, I could be wrong, perhaps Alok you will correct me, but I don't think it ever opens up to Urdu vocabulary, what it regards as Urdu. It doesn't open up to that. What would you say, Alok?
I'm sorry, I was
Yeah, okay.
So just a second. Lady back there, please. Just a second.
I really enjoyed your talk. One thing I would like to ask you is that you've spoken about modernity and modernism in the Hindi world.
Yeah.
How does it compare with modernity and modernism of the English world?
Which English world? Are we talking about the Indian English world?
No, not Indian English, but
England,
yeah.
England at large. I don't think, I've never tried to undertake a comparison. I don't think it would be a very fair thing to do, because modernism, as we know it, classical modernism, happens in the early 20th century, if you think of Eliot and so on. So modernism is also a word that comes into vogue. Raymond Williams has written about it in the 1960s, 50s and 60s.
So what I meant was, what are the identifying features of modernism?
Yes. So how do I was constrained by my material by looking at these novels very closely to actually resort to using modernism. I did so a little unhappily in the beginning, because you're importing a term that the people concerned themselves are not using, right? So why did I resort to modernism? Because I saw that there was a real watershed in the 1940s. You see? As we know that in 1937, the Congress built provincial governments in the north, that it began to share in power.
Yeah.
And with that actually came, almost simultaneously, came a disillusionment with the idea of nation and nationalism. Though of course we had that great uprising in the 1942 Quit India movement. I'm not saying nationalism went away, but nationalism for intellectuals became a very problematic proposition. It wasn't going to usher in the great paradise. A new era was not necessarily going to begin. It was going to be more of the old under a new guise, and people talk about it. So what happens is, to come back to why modernism, I use that term to speak of a condition in modernity where the individual is without direction. Okay?
Thank you.
Right?
Yeah.
Without direction in personal life, where love and happiness and all of these things have become very problematic enterprises. Love alone doesn't do it.
The stabilizing center is missing.
it just goes away. It just goes away. In personal life as well as in political life. And that's the moment I chose to call modernism.
Thank you.
Yeah, please.
I was quite taken aback by your remark that evolution of Hindi has happened almost as a kind of deliberate turning away from, a certain section of society or a certain kind of language. I'm no linguistic historian, but would you not also like to look at the evolution of this language as a consolidation of several smaller nations? I mean, it's a linguistic consolidation, so to say. I quite agree that there was a project. It developed as a project. There were people, there were fierce nationalists, who were involved in the project of developing Hindu. But even at that transition point, when you look at somebody like Bhartendu Harishchandra or Khadi Boli and so on and so forth, there are so many distinct and different diverse streams which needed to be consolidated, to weld it together into the main nationalist stream. So therefore, one could probably look at it, in those terms rather than take this extremist view. I'm sorry to be spelling out a bit of a judgment, but I think it is a bit of an extremist view.
This is a hornet's nest, believe me.
Yes, it is.
But you have the podium.
No, I don't know what to say about this. I mean, what are my own feelings about it? That would be a completely different story. But, so I'm not quite sure I understood what you said, but there are diverse streams. It isn't as homogeneous as so there are, as I have in this short presentation tried to make it out to be, because Hindi itself is now, we talk about the Hindi heartland, we talk about, the north is Hindi, does everyone speak Hindi? What kind of Hindi do they speak? How many so-called dialects, many of them with literatures in their own rights, have been absorbed in this Hindi and are still struggling to establish some kind of a presence in today's world. All of that is there. I mean, it's an effort to homogenize, but is it an effort that has ever been complete? I would like to think not.
It's a long debate.
Yes.
It is a long one.
Yes. Yes. Well, I can hardly advertise my own book as the answer. But yes, for those who are interested in going deeper into the question, I have written a book on this 19th century push to create a Hindu Hindi.
Okay. I think I've been told that it's time to bring this to an end. I think I'd better forego my own opportunity to make a few presidential remarks. I will get my chance, don't worry. I will be back. So thank you very much, Vasudha.
Thank you.
That was most enjoyable, and I'm sure we're off to a good start.